Part 70 of the Chronicles of Crime, Volume 1, by Camden Pelham. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 70. James Hardy Vaux, transported for privately stealing. Part 3. The next adventure, says Vaux, I shall have occasion to relate, more fully confirms the justice of the remark, that the connections formed by persons during temporary confinement in a jail commonly lead to further acts of wickedness, and frequently entail on the parties a more severe punishment than that which they have just escaped. This was exactly my unhappy case, and now I come to the most fatal era of my eventful life. In the same ward with myself were confined two brothers, very genteel young men, who had been recently cast for death for privately stealing some valuable rings, etc., from the shop of a jeweller in Leadenhall Street. As a conformity of character, or similarity in pursuits, is the strongest source of friendship, so these persons and myself had become very intimately acquainted. In the course of our frequent conversations on the subject, with which we were all three alike most conversant, the brothers informed me that they had, like myself, made a successful tour of the jewellers' shops in London, and on our comparing notes as to the particular persons we had robbed, or attempted to rob, they pointed out about half a dozen shops which it appeared I had omitted to visit, arising either from their making no display of their goods, or from their being situated in private streets, where I had no idea of finding any such trades. Though at that time neither they nor myself entertained much hope of my acquittal, it was agreed that, in the event of my being so fortunate as to recover my freedom, I should pay my respects to the several tradesmen I had so overlooked, and I promised, in case I was successful, to make them a pecuniary acknowledgment in return for their information. At the moment of my joyful departure from Newgate, they accordingly furnished me with a list of the shops in question, and gave me full instructions and useful hints for my guidance therein. They particularly pointed out a Mr. Bilger, a goldsmith and jeweller of the first eminence in Piccadilly. This gentleman, they assured me, I should find, in the technical phrase, a good flat. They advised me to bespeak a diamond ring or similar article, and to request a sight of some loose diamonds for the purpose of selecting such stones as I might wish to have set, informing me that he was generally provided with a large quantity, which he would not fail to show me, and that I might with ease purloin a good number of them. A day or two after my release I made the prescribed experiments, and was fortunate enough to succeed pretty well at nearly every shop, but I reserved Mr. Bilger for my final essay, as he was the principal object of consideration, and from whom I expected to obtain the most valuable booty. On the day se'nnight after my trial at the Old Bailey, I prepared in due form to pay him a visit. About 5 o'clock in the evening I entered his shop, dressed in the most elegant style, having a valuable gold watch and appendages, a gold eye glass, etc. I had posted my old friend and aide de camp, Bromley, at the door, in order to be in readiness to act as circumstances might require, and particularly to watch the motions of Mr. Bilger and his assistants on my quitting the premises. On my entrance, Mrs. Bilger issued from a back parlour behind the shop, and politely inquiring my business, I told her I wished to see Mr. Bilger. She immediately rang a bell, which brought down her husband from the upper apartments. He saluted me with a low bow, and handed me a seat. I was glad to find no other persons in the shop, Mrs. Bilger having again retired. I now assumed the air of a Bond Street lounger, and informed Mr. Bilger that I had been recommended by a gentleman of my acquaintance to deal with him, having occasion for a very elegant diamond ring, and requested to see his assortment. Mr. Bilger expressed his concern that he happened not to have a single article of that description by him, but if I could without inconvenience call again, he would undertake in 1 hour to procure me a selection from his working jeweller, to whom he would immediately dispatch a messenger. I affected to feel somewhat disappointed, but looking at my watch, after a moment's reflection, I said, "Well, Mr. Bilger, I have an appointment at the Cannon Coffee House, which requires my attendance, and if you will without fail have the articles ready, I may probably look in a little after 6. This he promised faithfully to do, declaring how much he felt obliged by my condescension, and I sauntered out of the shop, Mr. Bilger attending me in the most obsequious manner to the outer door. After walking a short distance, Bromley tapped me on the shoulder, and inquired what conduct I meant next to pursue, for he had viewed my proceedings through a glass door in the shop, and saw that I had not executed my grand design. I related to Bromley the result of my conversation with Mr. Bilger, and added that I meant to retire to the nearest public house, where we would enjoy a pipe and a glass of negus until the expiration of the hour, to which I had limited myself. We accordingly regaled ourselves at a very snug house, nearly opposite Bilger's, until about 6:30, when I again repaired to the scene of action, leaving Bromley as at first posted at the door. Mr. Bilger received me with increased respect, and producing a small card box, expressed his sorrow that his workmen had only been enabled to send 3 rings for my inspection, but that if they were not to my taste, he should feel honoured and obliged in taking my directions for having one made, and flattered himself he should execute the order to my satisfaction. I proceeded to examine the rings he produced, one of which was marked 16 guineas, another 9 guineas, and a third 6 guineas. They were all extremely beautiful, but I affected to consider them as too paltry, telling Mr. Bilger that I wanted one to present to a lady, and that I wished to have a ring of greater value than the whole 3 put together, as a few guineas would not be an object in the price. Mr. Bilger's son, who was also his partner, now joined us, and was desired by his father to sketch a draft in pencil of some fancy rings, agreeable to the directions I should give him. The 3 rings I had viewed were now removed to the end of the counter next to the window, and I informed the young man that I wished to have something of a cluster, a large brilliant in the centre, surrounded with smaller ones, but repeated my desire that no expense might be spared to render the article strictly elegant and worthy a lady's acceptance. The son having sketched a design of several rings on a card, I examined them with attention, and appeared in doubt which to prefer, but desired to see some loose diamonds, in order to form a better idea of the size, &c. of each ring described in the drawing. Mr. Bilger, however, declared he had not any by him. It is probable he spoke the truth, or he might have lost such numbers by showing them as to deter him from exhibiting them in future. Without having made up my mind on the subject, I now requested to see some of his most fashionable brooches or shirt pins. Mr. Bilger produced a show glass, containing a variety of articles in pearl, but he had nothing of the kind in diamonds. I took up 2 or 3 of the brooches, and immediately sunk a very handsome one, marked 3 guineas, in my coat sleeve. I next purloined a beautiful clasp for a lady's waist, consisting of stones set in gold, which had the brilliancy and appearance of real diamonds, but marked only 4 guineas. I should probably have gone still deeper, but at this moment a lady coming in desired to look at some earrings, and the younger Mr. Bilger immediately quitted his father to attend upon her at the other end of the shop. It struck me that now was my time for a decisive stroke. The card containing the diamond rings, procured from the maker, lying very near the show glass I was viewing, and many small articles irregularly placed round about them, the candles not throwing much light upon that particular spot, and Mr. Bilger's attention being divided between myself and the lady, to whom he frequently addressed himself, I suddenly took the 3 rings from the card, and committed them to my sleeve to join the brooch on the lady's clasp, but had them so situated that I could in a moment have released and replaced them on the counter, had an inquiry been made for them. I then looked at my watch, and observing that I was going to the theatre, told Mr. Bilger that I would not trouble him any further, as the articles before me were too tawdry and common to please me, but that I would put the card of drafts in my pocket book, and if I did not meet with the ring of the kind I wanted before Monday or Tuesday, I would certainly call again and give him final directions. I was then drawing on my gloves, being anxious to quit the shop while I was well, but Mr. Bilger, who seemed delighted with the prospect of my custom, begged so earnestly that I would allow him to show me his brilliant assortment of gold watches, that I could not refuse to gratify him, though I certainly incurred a great risk by my compliance. I therefore answered, "Really, Mr. Bilger, I am loath to give you that unnecessary trouble, as I have, you may perceive, a very good watch already, in point of performance, though it cost me a mere trifle, only 20 guineas, but it answers my purpose as well as a more valuable one. However, as I may probably before long want an elegant watch for a lady, I don't care if I just run my eye over them." Mr. Bilger replied that the greater part of his stock were fancy watches adapted for ladies, and he defied all London united to exhibit a finer collection. He then took from his window a show glass containing about 30 most beautiful watches, some ornamented with pearls or diamonds, others elegantly enamelled or chased in the most delicate style. They were of various prices, from 30 to 100 guineas, and the old gentleman, rubbing his hands with an air of rapture, exclaimed, "There they are, sir, a most fashionable assortment of goods. Allow me to recommend them. They are all a-going, sir, all a-going." I smiled inwardly at the latter part of this speech, and thought to myself, I wish they were going with all my heart, along with the diamond rings. I answered they were certainly very handsome, but I would defer a minute inspection of them until my next visit, when I should have more time to spare. These watches were ranged in exact order in 5 parallel lines, and between each watch was placed a gold seal, or other trinket appertaining to a lady's watch. It was no easy matter, therefore, to take away a single article without it being instantly missed, unless the economy of the whole had been previously deranged. I contrived, however, to displace a few of the trinkets on pretence of admiring them, and ventured to secrete one very rich gold seal, marked 6 guineas. I then declared I could stay no longer, as I had appointed to meet a party at the theatre, but that I would certainly call again in a few days, and lay out some money in return for the trouble I had given. Mr. Bilger expressed his thanks in the most respectful terms, and waited upon me to the door, where he took leave of me with a very low congé à la mode de France, of which country he was a native. I now put the best foot foremost, and having gained a remote street, turned my head, and perceived Bromley at my heels, who seized my hand, congratulating me on my success, and complimenting me on the address I had shown in this exploit, for he had witnessed all that passed, and knew that I had succeeded in my object, by the manner in which I had quitted the shop. He informed me that Mr. Bilger had returned to his counter, and without attending to the arrangement of the articles thereon, had joined his son, who was still waiting upon the lady, and that he, Bromley, had finally left them both engaged with her. Such was his rapacity that he renewed his visit to Mr. Bilger's shop, but the reception he met satisfied him that he was suspected. He, however, left an order for a splendid ring, and while the jeweller's son, as Vaux thought, was taking down his directions, he was only writing a description of his person, and a handbill in a few days was widely circulated among the pawnbrokers, peace officers, etc. A day or two after Vaux called at Turner's, a pawnbroker, in Bridges Street, Covent Garden, to redeem some article he had pledged, when he saw such manoeuvres in the shop as induced him to make a precipitate retreat and go into concealment. At length necessity, as he says himself, forced him out, and the first night he stole from a shop in Ludgate Street property to the amount of £4 or £5, with which he was so much pleased that he returned for his wife, and took her out to walk. Contrary to her earnest remonstrance, they went to a flash house near Clare Market, where the landlord betrayed him into the hands of justice, and he was hurried off to the watch house. Next day he underwent an examination at Bow Street, and was remanded. During the interval between his first and second appearance, he had completely metamorphosed his person by cutting his hair and whiskers, and putting on a mean suit of clothes, but all would not do. He was recognised through this disguise, and fully committed. His trial came on at the Old Bailey, February 15th, 1809, and the facts being sworn to, he was found guilty. Death. The sentence was afterwards commuted to transportation for life, preparatory to which he was conveyed on board the Retribution hulk at Woolwich. I had now, says Vaux, a new scene of misery to contemplate, and of all the shocking scenes I had ever beheld, this was the most distressing. There were confined in this floating dungeon nearly 600 men, most of them double ironed, and the reader may conceive the horrible effects arising from the continual rattling of chains, the filth and vermin naturally produced by such a crowd of miserable inhabitants, the oaths and execrations constantly heard among them, and above all from the shocking necessity of associating and communicating more or less with so depraved a set of beings. On arriving on board, we were all immediately stripped and washed in large tubs of water. Then, after putting on each a suit of coarse slop clothing, We were ironed and sent below, our own clothes being taken from us, and detained till we could sell or otherwise dispose of them, as no person is exempted from the obligation to wear the ship dress. On descending the hatchway, no conception can be formed of the scene which presented itself. I shall not attempt to describe it, but nothing short of a descent to the infernal regions can be at all worthy of a comparison with it. I soon met with many of my old Botany Bay acquaintances, who were all eager to offer me their friendship and services, that is, with a view to rob me of what little I had, for in this place there is no other motive or subject for ingenuity. All former friendships or connections are dissolved, and a man here will rob his best benefactor, or even messmate, of an article worth one halfpenny. Every morning at 7 o'clock all the convicts capable of work, or in fact all who are capable of getting into the boats, are taken ashore to the warren in which the Royal Arsenal and other public buildings are situated, and are there employed at various kinds of labour, some of them very fatiguing, and while so employed, each gang of 16 or 20 men is watched and directed by a fellow called a guard. These guards are most commonly of the lowest class of human beings, wretches devoid of all feeling, ignorant in the extreme, brutal by nature, and rendered tyrannical and cruel by the consciousness of the power they possess. No others but such as I have described would hold the situation, their wages being not more than a day labourer would earn in London. They invariably carry a large and ponderous stick, with which, without the smallest provocation, they will fell an unfortunate convict to the ground, and frequently repeat their blows long after the poor sufferer is insensible. At noon the working party return on board to dinner, and at 1 again go on shore, where they labour till near sunset. On returning on board in the evening, all hands are mustered by a roll, and the whole being turned down below, the hatches are put over them and secured for the night. As to the food, the stipulated ration is very scanty, but of even part of that they are defrauded. Their provisions, being supplied by contractors and not by government, are of the worst kind, such as would not be considered eatable or wholesome elsewhere, and both the weight and measure are always deficient. The allowance of bread is said to be about 20 ounces per day. 3 days in the week they have about 4 ounces of cheese for dinner, and the other 4 days a pound of beef. The breakfast is invariably boiled barley, of the coarsest kind imaginable, and of this the pigs of the hulk come in for a third part, because it is so nauseous that nothing but downright hunger will enable a man to eat it. For supper they have on banyan days burgoo, of as good a quality as the barley, and which is similarly disposed of, and on meat days the water in which the beef was boiled is thickened with barley, and forms a mess called smiggins, of a more detestable nature than either of the two former. The reader may conceive that I do not exaggerate when I state that among the convicts the common price of these several eatables is, for a day's allowance of beef, 1 halfpenny, ditto of cheese, 1 halfpenny, ditto of bread, 3 halfpence, but the cheese is most commonly so bad that they throw it away. It is manufactured, I believe, of skimmed milk for this particular contract. The beef generally consists of old bulls or cows who have died of age or famine. The least trace of fat is considered a phenomenon, and it is far inferior upon the whole to good horse flesh. I once saw the prisoners throw the whole day's supply overboard the moment it was hoisted out of the boat, and for this offence they were severely flogged. The friends of these unhappy persons are not allowed to come on board, but must remain alongside during their visit. The prisoners are, it is true, suffered to go into their boat, but a guard is placed within hearing of their conversation, and if a friend or parent has come 100 miles, they are not allowed above 10 minutes interview, so that instead of consolation, the visit only excites regret at the parties being so suddenly torn asunder. All letters, too, written by prisoners, must be delivered unsealed to the chief mate for his inspection before they are sent ashore, and such as he thinks obnoxious are of course suppressed. In like manners, all letters received from the post office are opened and scrutinised. If I were to attempt a full description of the miseries endured in these ships, I could fill a volume, but I shall sum up all by stating that besides robbery from each other, which is as common as cursing and swearing, I witnessed among the prisoners themselves during the 12-month I remained with them, 1 deliberate murder, for which the perpetrator was executed at Maidstone, and 1 suicide, and that unnatural crimes are openly committed. From the misery of the hulks he was removed on the 15th of June 1810, for the second time, to Botany Bay. His wife, who had all along manifested the utmost attention, was prevented by a succession of unfortunate circumstances from seeing him previous to his departure, nor does it appear that he knew what became of her afterwards. On the 16th of the following December, the transport arrived at Sydney Cove, where Vaux found that the report of his exploits in London had preceded him. He endeavoured to make interest with the governor, in the hope of being employed as a clerk, but this being his second visit, he was listened to with distrust, and was sent up the country to a settler, who used him with great barbarity. To escape from this tyranny, Vaux feigned himself sick, and thus procured his removal to the hospital, from which he was discharged in a month, and appointed overseer to a town gang. He now resolved to lead a correct life, and establish, if possible, a character for himself, seeing, as he says, the necessity of good conduct, from the consequences that invariably attend on an improper one. If we believe him, he adhered firmly to his vows of rectitude, but his notorious character operated against him, and he fell a victim to prejudice and the depravity of a youth who was a veteran in iniquity. This young villain's name was Edwards. He was servant to Mr. Bent, the judge advocate, from whom he purloined bills and money. Vaux, suspecting his dishonesty, warned him of his danger, but the artful thief accounted for his being so flush in money by the presents he was in the habit of receiving from his master's visitors. One evening he came running into Vaux's lodgings, and requested of him to keep some articles and parcels which he put into his hand. Vaux at first refused, but was ultimately prevailed on to keep them for a few minutes. Edwards had scarcely departed, when he thought he did wrong, and acquainted his landlord with the transaction. That person desired him to go immediately and deliver the property up to the judge advocate in a public manner, as the only way left him to escape being implicated with Edwards, and with this advice Vaux resolved to comply, but having stopped first to smoke a pipe before he had finished it, 2 officers entered and apprehended him. His conduct was open, and his landlord disposed in his favour, but Edwards accused him, in revenge for giving up the property, of being an accomplice, and he was finally banished to the Coal River, where he continued doing all kinds of work for 2 years, after which he was permitted to return to Sydney, where he was once more placed in the town gang. Again he renewed his vows of rectitude, but was unable to obtain any station less degrading than the one in which he was placed. The picture before him was disheartening in the extreme, an exile for life, and compelled to labour at the basest and lowest employment of mankind. A British sailor took compassion on him, and offered, in 1814, to conceal him in his vessel until she should sail, and he embraced the generous proposal, but after lying close and undiscovered for 4 days, some one on board gave information, and the unfortunate wretch was dragged ashore, punished with 50 lashes, and sentenced to transportation to the Coal River for 1 year. In a few days, he says in his memoirs, I was accordingly embarked with 11 other prisoners, and a second time landed at Newcastle, from whence I had been absent nearly 12 months. On my arrival, it happened that the storekeeper of that settlement was in want of a clerk, and he applying to the commandant for me, I was appointed to that situation, in which I still continue, and having scrupulously adhered to my former vows of rectitude, and used every exertion to render myself serviceable to my employer, and to merit his good opinion as well as that of the commandant. I have had the satisfaction to succeed in these objects, and I am not without hope that, when I am permitted to quit my present service and return to Sydney, my good conduct will be rewarded with a more desirable situation. I have now been upwards of 7 years a prisoner, and knowing the hopeless sentence under which I labour, I shall, I trust, studiously avoid in future every act which may subject me to the censure of my superiors, or entail upon me a repetition of those sufferings I have already too severely experienced. I have thus described, perhaps too minutely for the reader's patience, the various vicissitudes of my past life. Whether the future will be so far diversified as to afford matter worthy of being committed to paper, either to amuse a vacant hour, or to serve as a beacon which may warn others to avoid the rocks on which I have unhappily split, is only known to the great Disposer of events. The memoirs written by himself, from which we have extracted the most interesting passages, here terminate. We have been more willing to give the adventures of this notorious villain as he gives them, although we confess that we are of the opinion that there is some exaggeration in what he states, because, however great may be the depravity of which he admits he was guilty, his punishments and his miseries convey a moral most forcibly depicting the danger of such a line of conduct as he adopted. His memoirs were written by himself in the year 1816, and were published in London about 3 years afterwards. Of his subsequent career we know little, but we learn by recent accounts received from Sydney that this hoary old sinner, at the age of 57, has been convicted and sentenced to an imprisonment of 2 years' duration upon a charge of indecently assaulting a girl of tender age. Whatever may have been his course of life in later years, however frightful may have been his career of sin in his younger days, we hold that this new offence, of which he has been found guilty, is the crowning crime of the whole, and we regret that the human heart should have arrived at such a degree of profligacy as to admit the guilt of youth, and to be unable to withstand its temptation in old age. End of Part 70.